Okay, I think we are live on Facebook. It's free. We shall start. Uh, Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I am Avikar. I'm a member of People's Resource Center, uh, and I welcome you all on behalf of the entire team. Uh, it's the fourth session of Farming the City 2021. The theme of the session is environmental and climate crisis. आप सभी का हम जुड़ने के लिए शुक्रिया। मेरा नाम अविकल है और मैं जन संसाधन केंद्र में एक सदस्य हूँ। फार्मिंग द सिटी वेबिनार के आयोजक समूह की तरफ से मैं आप सभी का स्वागत करता हूँ। आज का सत्र फार्मिंग द सिटी 2021 का चौथा सत्र है। थीम है जलवायु संकट। Before anything, I would like to tell you that there's an option of interpretation on this webinar. You can check the option for language interpretation in your Zoom. For listening to interpretation in English, please switch to English. In interpretation, Astitva and Avanish are helping us. Thank you. सबसे पहले मैं आपको बताना चाहूंगा कि इस वेबिनार में हिंदी में इंटरप्रिटेशन का विकल्प भी उपलब्ध है। अपने जूम मेन्यू में लैंग्वेज इंटरप्रिटेशन पर क्लिक कर हिंदी का ऑप्शन आप चूज करेंगे तो आपको हिंदी में इंटरप्रिटेशन सुनाई देगा। इस प्रक्रिया में हमारी हेल्प अस्तित्व और अवनीश कर रहे हैं। थैंक यू सो मच। For better accessibility to the discussion, we will be providing a live summary of the discussion in Hindi and English. Please keep watching the chat box for the same. Mohini and Isaac are helping us for that. Thank you, Mohini. Thank you, Isaac. इस चर्चा की भागीदारी में मदद के लिए हमारे साथ चर्चा के मुख्य बिंदुओं पर बात रखने के लिए साथ साथ चैट बॉक्स में लिखने के लिए मोहिनी और आइज़ैक मौजूद हैं। तो आप चैट बॉक्स पर नजर रखिएगा तो उसमें हिंदी और इंग्लिश पे लगातार ट्रांसक्रिप्शन होता रहेगा। A quick note about the organizers. People's Resource Center is a forum to create community resources for social transformation and to build perspectives and alternatives. PRC engages with open groups and communities in the places with ongoing or potential struggle over resources and regularly undertakes policy monitoring, research, and documentation, and grassroots networking to generate resources for collective resistance and creative action. Institute for Democracy and Sustainability has carved out a niche for itself among the people-centric organization while working actively on the issues of social transformation, including sustainable urban transport, equal road rights, right to livelihood, and urban agriculture for the last 3 decades. IDS is a constituent member of National Alliance for People's Movement, NAPM, Sustainable Urban Mobility Network of India, that is SUMNET, and CAFRI Network, and is associated with several national and international forums. TRIP at IIT Delhi is an interdisciplinary program focusing on the reduction of adverse health effects of road transport. TRIP attempts to integrate all issues concerning transportation in order to promote safety, cleaner air, and energy conservation. We will also archive all these presentations and discussions, video recordings, and photo exhibitions on our website. Meanwhile, you can follow us on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Somebody from our team will shortly post a link for that. I'll go through some modalities of the participation in the webinar. Panelists will present their work in 15 to 20 minutes, and after all of them complete the presentation, we will take questions. Please write your questions in the chat box. You may ask your question in Hindi and English. If you want to ask a question by speaking, please wait till the end of the discussion. Depending on the available time, we'll have participants speaking their views. For speaking, please raise your hand. There's an option for that in the Zoom menu. We'll try to take as many questions as possible according to the available time. Regardless, we'll try to respond to your questions which are left on a follow-up email. We will circulate to a follow-up email to all attendees to let the discussion continue even beyond the webinar limit. You can share questions, suggestions, feedback, articles, and other resources related to the discussion in the chat box or via email. We request all speakers to keep a slow pace. It will help in the translation as we are going live with the interpretation. Now, I would like to welcome Bhargavi Rao to take this session forward. Bhargavi works at the intersections of community action with law, policy, planning, and governance. He currently works as the Deputy Director, Center for Financial Accountability. She's also a trustee at Environment Support Group and advises many legal and regulatory interventions and research. She has 25 years of experience across research, advocacy, campaign, and teaching on a variety of human rights, governance, and people-centered efforts in areas of environmental and social justice. She was co-director of the Minnesota Studies in International Development India program. University of Minnesota, and co-director of the International Honors Program, SIT World Learning. She has worked with the Public Health Foundation of India, Azim Premji Scientific Initiatives, Environment Support Group, and at Department of Microbiology and Cell Biology, and the Indian Institute of Science. I welcome you, Bhargavi, to take the session forward.
Thank you everyone, and thanks everyone again at PRC for inviting me to this very important discussion and asking me to be the moderator. It's a privilege to be a moderator for this session. So as you all know, the session is on environment and climate crisis. And given this way our cities are growing today with absolutely no limit, they are the centers where all kinds of problems we are facing. I just moved from another meeting on smart cities and waste management. And we've seen in almost all our cities how waste management is a huge problem. Our food comes from hundreds of kilometers away. And cities today are trying very hard to manage their water, their food systems, their underground drainage, their waste, energy, practically everything. So in this context, we are so disconnected with our relationship with nature and the environment, because the kind of consumerism and the appropriation of all the natural resources, the way it is happening, we are far removed from what should be the right way in the context of climate change. And every day we are only adding to this irreversible change. And at such a crucial juncture comes this very important discussion on urban agriculture. And today's discussion, the speakers will reflect on how we are approaching these catastrophic scenarios if we continue to exploit our natural resources and try and find a sustainable solution based in and around all our cities. There are so many things that are possible, and today in many parts of the world, cities have shown a way out in small clusters, small neighborhoods. People have shown that it is possible to grow your own food, manage your own waste, generate your own electricity, and need not be connected to the grid. So there are so many things that we can all learn from. So broadly, today's discussion will focus on the following. One is the circular economy of waste with respect to urban agriculture, the role of allied activities such as fishing, aquaculture, and urban farming in the context of urban farming. Then we're also going to focus on urban climate justice and how urban agriculture fits into it. If urban agriculture can be an action plan in this and be included in the purview of climate justice. And what are some of the community initiatives to fight climate justice, possibly with some examples. And this also comes at a time when many cities across the world are signing up to the Paris Climate Agreement. Bangalore, for instance, has signed up for the Paris Climate Agreement. But what does it mean to the city? What are the things that it will commit to do? What steps is it going to take? How is it going to tell all its various departments of how to move forward? I think this discussion will largely address that. And we have some amazing speakers lined up for today. I'm very happy to introduce each one of them. So our speakers for today are Logan Strenchock, Soumya Datta, and Nithya Rao. It gives me great pleasure to introduce each one of them. So Logan Strenchak, he will mainly share the Cargonomia's work in Hungary along with some photos from the field. And he is basically somebody who's worked in the environment sector. He's the Environmental and Sustainability Officer at the Central European University, Budapest in Hungary, a garden team member of a 4-hectare organic fruit and vegetable farm in Hungary, and a co-founder of the Cargonomia, a community cargo bike center and local food distribution point in Budapest. He enjoys getting his hands dirty in mixing research and practice in degrowth inspired experimentation with a diverse team of collaborators living in Hungary. Thank you so much, Logan Strenchock, for joining us. Welcome to the session. And then I'm also happy to introduce Soumya Datta. Soumya, as all of you know, is a long-standing people science activist who has extensively written, studied, and lectured on climate, energy, and other ecological issues in many national and international fora, universities, and colleges, and as well as he has taught and trained thousands of school teachers, activists, and senior students in these areas. Presently, he is a co-convener of the South Asia People's Action on Climate Crisis, an advisory board member of the UN Climate Technology Center, trustee of the Collective Movement for Advancing Understanding of Sustainability and Mutuality, also known as MAUSM. And then he's also the founding organizing secretary of the Bharat Jan Gyan Vigyan Jata, and an executive member of FOE India and member of the Indian Council of GP. He's also a founding member of the India Climate Justice Platform, one of the founding members of the National Children's Science Congress, and an Ashoka Fellow. So today, Soumya is going to talk about the multiple climate and related ecological impacts of cities, including water and food, and how cities can not only reduce these impacts, but also give back some ecological services. And our third speaker for today is Nithya Rao. Nithya Rao is a professor, gender and development at the University of East Anglia, Norwich, United Kingdom. She will speak about issues related to urbanization and climate justice from a gender lens. Uh, to understand a little bit more about her work, she has worked extensively as a researcher and advocate in the field of women's rights, employment, and education for over 3 decades. Her research interests include exploring the gendered changes in land and agrarian relations, migration, and livelihoods, especially in context of climate variability and economic precarity. She has done fine-grained research on households and intra-household dynamics in these contexts to draw out implications for gendered well-being, empowerment, and justice, with a particular focus on food, nutrition, and health security. She has also published extensively on these themes in international peer-reviewed journals and books. She has consistently engaged with policy and practice at both the global and local levels. Apart from supporting networks on women farmers in India, she served on the Global Advisory Committee of the United Nations Girls Education Initiative for over a decade. She's currently a member of the steering group of the high-level panel of experts to the Global Commission on Food Security. She has additionally supervised and mentored over 25 PhD students and several early career researchers in the areas of her interest. Thank you, Professor Rao, and welcome to this panel. So we will first start with Logan Strenchock. Over to you, Logan. You have about 15 to 20 minutes. Over to you. Will you share your screen or should I help share it for you?
I will share my screen.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's also wonderful to be able to have a reach to all of the people out there in India and around the world. My name is Logan Strenchak, and I'm going to explain a number of projects, and I'm giving this presentation in honor of a diverse team which I work with. As mentioned in the introduction, I have a number of different hats that I wear, or a number of different tasks or activities in my life. I do work and teach and serve as a researcher at Central European University in Budapest for part of my week. For part of my week, I'm also an organic gardener at a 4-hectare vegetable and fruit farm about 1 hour from Budapest in Hungary. And also, in addition to this, I'm a founder and active participant in a self-organized cooperative. And I'm going to tell you more about how these three activities link together and what we're trying to accomplish with our dedicated team here in Hungary. It's a bit difficult to explain everything in a short time, but I want to at least be able to show a number of images which will help you get a better idea of the environment that I'm working in and the people that I'm working with. So first of all, The farm, Zsámboki Biokert, which basically means the organic garden of Zsámbok, is a 4-hectare organically certified and agroecology inspired fruit and vegetable farm operating about 1 hour from Budapest. We're growing basically everything that you can grow in Hungary throughout the seasons. We're following organic agricultural practices, and we're really doing as much as we can to think of a true collaboration with our biggest resource, which is the small ecosystem which we're managing. So one of our main goals is building this ecosystem, and especially protecting our biggest resource, our most valuable resource, which is the healthy soil, which we're asking a lot of. I'm also representing Cargonomia, which is a self-organized collective in Budapest, which focuses on cargo bicycle logistics and increasing the knowledge of and access to cargo bicycles for transport needs in the city. Beyond this, we also serve as a local food cooperative, which helps distribute some of the organic food which comes from the farm. We also manage a number of urban gardening projects, and we organize a lot of community events to get people talking about sustainability issues within their own community and the city that we live in. It's really important to mention that this collaboration is quite unique. It involves people living in the city, people living in the countryside, building a community and a conscious community in the urban context is something that we do, but especially if we're taking into account modern environmental issues, we certainly have to work to reduce the distance between what is happening in the city and what is happening in the countryside. And also we can't forget about the countryside or the non-rural areas as being a key asset in the climate change battle. So we're working really hard to experiment in and link together communities based in rural locations and urban locations at the same time. And there's ways you can do this which bring together very, very different types of people. Our team on the farm is quite diverse and quite unique. We have a number of people who lived in the village their whole life and have been working in agriculture their whole life. We also have some those who escaped the urban environment and moved to the countryside to be practicing, to have more of a natural lifestyle. We're very happy to be working with a team that is diverse in age, cultural background, and experience as well. And we can do a lot of amazing things with a relatively small team. Our team on the farm and our activist group in the city are working very closely together. So we also involve a number of people who have lived and worked in Hungary in their whole life, and a number of people who have recently moved to Hungary, perhaps from different countries. And it's a nice collaboration between young students, some of the older residents in the village, some people who have a very advanced higher education background, some who have a more advanced, many more years of experience in traditional skills such as agriculture or woodworking or craft work with their hands. And this collection of people creates a very nice environment on the farm and also in our activities in the city. What we're actually doing, our agricultural style is considered to be bio-intensive organic market gardening. So when I said the farm is 4 hectares, for some of you, that might sound like a really large area, but actually compared to the global agricultural picture, 4 hectares is very, very small. And most of our vegetable production is coming from 1 hectare. So we're producing a lot of vegetables. We're doing it mostly by hand, and we're selling them directly to customers within our own location. One of our biggest challenges, since we're not using machines, is to make sure that our garden is planned very efficiently and to make sure that the work that we're doing is also very efficient. Now, you might ask, what exactly is a cargo bike collective? We're trying to encourage people to take more interest in using bikes for more activities in the city. We're working towards more livable cities. We're trying to prove that a lot of what people have formerly done, perhaps with a car or motorized vehicle, is also possible with a bicycle. And the cargo bicycle is a good, simple tool for starting a more complex discussion about the type of city that we want to live in and the type of city that we want to build together. So we work to make these bicycles more accessible to people in our community, but we also then take the bicycle into a more complex discussion about what type of changes we want to work together to encourage in the city that we live in. On the farm and also in the city, our activities are really inspired by do-it-yourself technological solutions and low technological solutions. When we're talking about environmental issues, a lot of the movement from business is trying to encourage us to believe falsely in the benefits of very, very complex technology. But complex technology also has a large environmental footprint and is not accessible to all communities. So we're doing the most with what we can, with open source, low tech, and low embedded carbon emission technologies. And these are the practices we're following both on the farm and also in the city as well. So the wheel hoe, which is the tool I'm using here, it has a lot of similarities with something like the cargo bike. It's very effective, it's well designed, it's managed by human power, but can accomplish a lot of activities, very useful activities in different ways. Our production system on the farm is to try to be in unison with the environment. Most agriculture globally is exploitative of the environment, especially exploiting the soil. Basically, our biggest problem in agriculture is mining the resources in the soil, which took thousands of years to develop. I'm sure you're quite familiar with the statistic that says globally, we only have something like 50 harvests left before we destroy the value of topsoil globally. So we're working really hard to make sure that we're not taking more out of the soil than we're putting back. So it's quite rare in our production system that we're making and managing our own compost, which we're returning back to the soil each year. And it's the key, the heart of our agroecological approach. As you can see, we're growing a diversity of vegetables. It's really important for us to know, basically in person, where the food is going. So our system isn't designed to send the vegetables that we grow very far away. We're responsible for all aspects of the production system, from growing the food to getting it to people, to talking with people about their expectations for participating in a local food system. So there's a lot of pressure on us, not only to focus on production, but also the other requirements for managing a small farm and making it work in a way which provides a stable livelihood for workers. So it's a quite complex process. In the city, besides dealing with bicycles, we're also experimenting with the reappropriation of city space, of urban space. So that basically means increasing access to land in the city. So we can take something like organic agriculture knowledge, which is based in a rural activity, and transfer the knowledge to residents in the city and use it as a platform for urban residents to start getting reconnected with nature through urban agriculture. And access to space which isn't commodified, is a really difficult challenge in the urban environment. So we're mostly working with turning formerly abandoned spaces back into natural spaces where communities can work together and practice agriculture. And we connect these values which have relevance on the farm, in the countryside, and we pass the knowledge back to urban residents through participatory projects. And these type of events we organize, it's really important not just to have an event and talk about an issue, but to teach people something as well, whether it's about permaculture or agroecology, or learning more about how to fix your bike or what you might use a cargo bicycle for. And perhaps most importantly, the farm is much more than a place where seeds go in the ground and food comes out of the ground. It is a living classroom for all ages and for all different levels of experience with agriculture. So we work really hard to keep our doors open on the farm and host lots of different types of groups. And it's really one of my favorite parts of working on the farm and also working with Cargonomia is when we get to interact with the younger generations. Of course, working to also pass on the knowledge of the very valuable knowledge of older generations as well. And I will just wrap up here and say that what we're working towards is rebuilding communities. The basis of the type of communities we're working with are conscious food communities, but food is a way, and food production, whether it's done in the countryside or done in the city, is a way to bring people together. And the farm has a responsibility to operate as a business. Of course, it can't exist if it won't sustain itself, but we have a larger, very important social purpose, which is we want to spread knowledge. We want to bring people together. We want to, through our local food system, get people to take an interest and to participate in the transition in the communities that we're living in. So the production and distribution of local food is a gateway for a much more complex discussion about participation in social development and environmentally conscious development in the communities that we live in. And so these basic goals, and this was just a brief introduction, but I hope to be able to answer better today in the discussion, is how we can bring together unique communities, unique groups of people, urban dwellers and rural dwellers, and help them to exchange knowledge, help them to exchange concerns, and figure out ways to link the urban and rural sustainability movements so that they can assist each other instead of working quite independently. And just lastly, me personally, as someone who is working as a gardener in the countryside, I want to really reinforce that we can't forget about the importance of rural livelihoods and making sure that the farmers of the future can earn a livelihood through agricultural activity that happens outside of the city. And I look forward to getting to discuss this more with you today.
Thank you, Logan. That was an amazing story, a great, a very unique initiative of connecting urban residents to the rural and to the countryside, and also valuing the knowledge of the seniors in the rural areas who have so much knowledge in farming and how to grow and when to grow. And it was interesting to know that you grow practically everything, you said, and throughout the year. So we will wait for the question answer session. Let's hear all the speakers and then take the question answers. So we will now move on to Professor Nithya Rao.
Thank you so much, Bhargavi. I hope you can see my screen.
Yeah.
Okay, it's gone off. Yeah, thank you. I think that was very interesting, both your opening remarks and Logan's comments. I've just got a few slides, but more to help me really make some of the points that I wanted to make. This morning, I think some of you who had joined, some of my colleagues, Sheetal and Parama, had presented some of the field insights from the work that we are doing in Bangalore and Chennai. But I just wanted to, give a sort of wider view rather than going into that data specifically, and use some more broader examples. I think just to start first, I just wanted to start with, gender and gender justice and what we mean by it, especially because of the discussions around the Paris agreements and so on, and what gender means. And often it has been taken as just women as one kind of category. And I think here, especially in the context of urbanization, I wanted to emphasize. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear somebody else though.
Yeah. Can everybody else keep their microphones on mute, please? Thank you. Yeah.
So it's really looking at not just gender as women, but really as a category. It looks at the intersections of class, caste, race, and ethnicity. And I think this comes out in the literature a lot, particularly from the global north about, and the US and other places, about the role of race actually in urban agriculture and access to urban green spaces. That there is a whole debate around gentrification and the wealthier actually having access to space compared to poorer groups. So poverty and gender. So really, I'll try and kind of give some examples which looks sort of at women also differently across their class, caste, etc. And I think the three kind of core elements in terms of rights or justice is really about power and power relations, that we do recognize that there are unequal power relations and we need to challenge this. including gender norms. Secondly, the diversity, and that there is equity and equality in diversity. And very importantly, I think the redistribution of resources. I think Logan mentioned about urban space and the privatization of urban space. And this is something that I will also come to, that in terms of the distributions of urban space is highly unequal. So climate justice, again, I think I really liked this definition or the statement from Mary Robinson, who's chair of the group of elders, which says that climate justice insists on a shift from a discourse only on climate change in terms of greenhouse gases or melting ice caps, but into a civil rights movement with the people and communities most vulnerable to climate impacts at its heart. And I think this is the core of really where I'm coming from, that while this is a definition, how much gap is there really between climate action and climate movements, and actually putting the most vulnerable at the center. So it is really an ethical and a political issue both. I think we have a lot of global awareness now over the last 40 years, particularly on gender equality. There has been a lot of progressive policy change, including in India and globally. India, last 10, 15 years, we have the women's empowerment, the grassroots Panchayati Raj Act, the right to inherit property, a right to education, and so on. However, a number of issues do remain. And this is a chart from Equality Measure 2030, which was an exercise, cross-national exercise, which tried to measure how far principles of equity and justice, particularly in relation to gender, have been integrated into the various SDGs. And the green colored dots is really where it has been done, and there is progress. And as we move towards the red color, it's really that inadequate or very poor progress. So if you look at India, India is somewhere in the orange group overall score in terms of 56.2 overall score on certain matters. Here, India, in terms of especially SDG 2 and 3, in terms of poverty, health, food security, it doesn't do too badly. But I think what we're talking about today in terms of climate action, SDG 3, India performs very poorly. It has a low score, even though we have a action plan, the state action plans, the national action plan, which has gender components. Actually, we do very poorly according to the way this has been scored. The other area where we also do, which is urbanization in cities, I think also there is really a question that do these tend to further sharpen inequalities? Do these tend to heighten gender inequality? SDG 11 again is not that bad as climate action, but quite poor. And when we look at areas which are sensitive in terms of moving towards a net zero, like industry, infrastructure, innovation, where we can really try and cut our carbon footprint, that's again an area where India doesn't do very well in terms of equality. So this is just, even though these are macro indicators, I think it gives us a sense that where are we doing well and where are we doing badly, and the urgency of therefore taking on board some of the social issues, some of the inequality issues when we're talking about climate action and urbanization and cities in particular. I think the third area is really the third part of this discussion is about the role of urban and peri-urban agriculture within context of cities or context of urbanization. And this study that we have been doing is in not only in India, but also in Tanzania, two countries we are comparing. And it's very interesting that we find, and I think this is more at a global level as well, that quite contradictory discourses. So while at the one hand, it is recognized that urban and peri-urban agriculture has many advantages in terms, and as Logan pointed out, in terms of local food systems, food security, local employment generation, enhancing green spaces, recycling urban waste and water, also strengthening resilience to climate change, but also to nutrition through fresh produce and so on. And this we particularly saw, as Parama mentioned in the morning, in the context of last year, the lockdown resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, that a lot of people got a lot of interest in actually urban farming to shorten the food supply chains, encouraging local markets for fresh produce. There was also a lot of advertising around. In Tanzania, we found that the government itself was saying that as immunity boosters, they were advertising fresh vegetables, herbs, lemon, lemongrass, mint, and so on. So I think there's really been a great increase in interest on this in terms of shortening supply chains as well. But on the negative side, there's also a lot of critique of urban and peri-urban agriculture. And unfortunately, in policy domains, more so in terms of food safety and the health and environmental concerns due to water pollution, waste generation, and so on. When we look at it from an inclusion perspective or a gender lens, I think what becomes very important is what is the type of urban and peri-urban agriculture we are talking about. Because we're talking about rooftops and terraces. There's a whole range from rooftops and terraces to community gardens to the kind of farm that Logan was talking about, and commercial farms as well. And these actually, when we look at these carefully, they do reflect growing inequality by race, caste, class, and gender. As Sheetal mentioned in the morning, a lot of the terrace gardens, roof gardens is really amongst the middle classes. And the poor are really don't have that much space in order to be engaging in that kind of farming. So there's really a question about who has land and resources, access to space, very important. Who has access to jobs and the quality of jobs or a voice in decision making. I was reading a very interesting paper from the US, which was comparing two types of urban farms, what they call as civic agriculture, which has the goals of food security, local food communities, local food systems, inclusion, and so on. But there is a real trade-off between financial sustainability and business model versus social inclusion somehow. So one of the farms which involves a community-based organization in the US, but it basically focuses on financial sustainability. So it runs like a business model and it gives local community people jobs, especially the unemployed. However, because it is again grown organically and so on, but the local communities, which are mainly Black and minority communities, they can't really afford this produce. So then they market it in order to make profits and create these jobs. They market it to the elite. So half the purpose is not served. On the other hand, you have a more community-based farm, which focuses on creating a space for the local community, giving access to local produce and so on. But then this is highly subsidized. It is dependent upon grants. It is dependent upon local volunteers. And therefore, it is not really, if funding agencies and so on stop giving it grants, it will probably collapse. So it's not really viable. So I think there are real trade-offs in terms of what we see as challenges to inclusion. Specifically, when we look at gender, I think there are four main points, and I'll just give one example for each point. One is about the devaluation or invisibility of women's work in urban contexts. Secondly, also in rural, but also in urban, unequal access to space, to assets, and to infrastructure, poor health and nutrition, alongside the responsibility for food security and violence. And India, of course, is ranking pretty poorly in terms of the global gender gap report. So I think in terms of invisibility of women's work, I want to give two examples. I think Bhargavi, you mentioned waste, and this is a big issue for urban contexts. So in many of these, including in capital cities, but also in smaller towns, urban livestock rearing is very important. And here we really find a gender divide, that the commodified work, which gets the money selling the milk, is often male, but all the other activities from rearing, milking, cleaning, providing credit is women's work. Also feed. And this is where I think there is really a role that women play, which is very invisible in terms of gleaning waste, particularly from wholesale vegetable and other markets, but also from streets and rubbish dumps. And because this work is completely invisible, there is also very little support for it, either for women's work itself, or indeed in terms of policy, in terms of recognizing the linkages, for instance, between urban livestock rearing as a livelihood for some of the lower, poorer groups in urban contexts, and as a waste recycling or a waste management mechanism. These linkages are not really made. The other is waste itself. And I think this, I was really, this has become a huge problem, as you said, Bhargavi. And it is generated, I think, when we look especially in a context of growing capitalism and capitalist cities, that waste is generated from a range of sources, from production, from consumption, from distribution, from social reproduction, that is human waste as well in a capitalist society. Now, earlier we did have the municipal corporations and so on, which employed workers, municipal workers, paid them at least a living wage. What has happened with increasing sort of privatization and sort of the deregulation, if you like, of the state, that even these municipal corporations now are increasingly managing waste through private contractors. And from a labor perspective, what this has meant is that the same people who earlier had a living wage, they often belong in India to the lower caste, to Dalits, to scheduled tribes, and women particularly amongst them. They work now for half their wages, very low wages, on irregular contracts, very long shifts, with no facilities for toilets or childcare or anything else. And of course, there are hierarchies within this whole thing. What several studies have found is that these wages then hover just around the poverty line. So actually, even after working all day as a contract worker for the municipality, then women still, they cannot end their day there in order to provide for their household because of their particular responsibilities for household provisioning and food security. They then end up also doing a bit more of gleaning work, sorting, privately selling, and recycling waste. So they have to actually work after hours as well. On the second point, I would like to briefly talk about land and water as two very critical resources. And in rural contexts, of course, there would, women are excluded, we know, from water users associations and things like that. In a lot of city development, slum development schemes, they try to include women in managing common water resources, but many of these have actually not fallen out of use in more recent time. So while women play a very central role in water and its use in urban contexts, whether it is for cooking, whether it is for cleaning, there's very limited water. It seems that urban water distribution also ends up extracting women's unpaid labor because they're queuing up at these places to collect one bucket or two buckets. And I think especially during the lockdown, there were a lot of stories of not having, people kept saying that hand washing is very important, but in many urban slums, they really had very little water to keep on doing hand washing. And the pressure on women, again, increased in terms of their unpaid labor, but also controlling. By bodily rights, I mean that, where they wash, how they wash, whether they can take a bath, where they go to the toilet, at what time, and its health implications in terms of their bodies. Land is very important. I think I don't have that much time, but yesterday there was a session on rural urban connects and disconnects. And of course, a lot of the urban slum dwellers are migrants from the rural. And one big reason for this, I have worked actually in India a lot in rural areas and particularly with tribal groups. And a big reason is the privatization of nature, that the sort of privatization of common property resources, of nature, of forests, of land. And this has really displaced rural people at the bottom end and pushed them into urban slums. I think what has happened, and Logan mentioned this point, and I just wanted to re-emphasize it, about community and food communities, that within these rural contexts, particularly when there were common property resources, I think while people did have individual land, their farming practices, their pesticide use or cropping patterns or single crop or double crop did take care of what their neighbors, what others in the community were doing, because what I do has an impact on my neighbor. Now, with the growing privatization of these resources, these kind of social institutions, these kind of collective norms, which really took account of collective well-being, are also breaking down. So when these people move to the urban area, they're basically looking out for themselves in urban farms. They, of course, lack the space. And if at all, they get employment on other people's urban farms or in open spaces. In Tanzania, we found, or even in Delhi, open spaces where the tenure is insecure. That is where they are able to work. Amongst the middle classes, you have rooftop terrace gardens and so on. And I think this is great. But one must here remember that even here, this women's work is really undervalued or not valued. But all the explanations are that it's for aesthetics, it's for leisure activity, it gives women mental peace, stress reduction. I think Parama mentioned in the morning that when they did the survey at the time of COVID, a lot of these urban middle classes said that it's really relieving their stress and so on. So it is really seen in terms of individual well-being rather than any kind of collective benefits. And infrastructure. And I think this is a point that I did want to emphasize, that we have seen in rural contexts that women's agency and the social capital they have, whether through SHGs or through other ways, is very central to resilience, to mitigation, and to adaptation. So there are, a lot of low energy uses. Some of the pictures that Logan showed about, not using energy intensive tools, but a lot of the stuff around post-harvest, sun drying, drying, cooling, using cow dung as fuel, recycling. A lot of this happens in women's domain in the context of India. When we look at cities, and of course, transport is another big sector in terms of emissions, in terms of infrastructure. And perhaps because of women's lower access to assets and resources, lower access to money, actually women tend to use, even in the middle classes, public transport much more than men. Here again, I think we have to look at who is it who's able to, who has the money, the class and the gender. I remember in the 1980s when I was living in Delhi, in the common Asian Games were being held, and in the cleanup of Delhi, all the poor people were moved out to the slum resettlement programs. Many of the women there used to work as domestic workers in the center of the city, and they had to start using transport. But of course, only those who could afford to also pay for transport. It also, of course, raises issues of violence, of safety, of sexual harassment, because this is another big gender norm, that if women are out in the public space, then they're also exposing themselves to violence and harassment. In terms of the lockdown, I think we saw many of these things intensifying. That the employment, loss of employment in domestic work, petty services, uncertainty of incomes, but also 2 points that I want to emphasize is loss of dignity. I think when we look at the poor, we don't really look at them also as people with dignity and self-respect. A lot of them in Surat, in Ahmedabad, they became dependent on NGOs for daily food packets. It was not according to their taste. They had no access to toilets. If they went out of these very crowded accommodation, 30 or 40 staying to a room, they were beaten up by the police and so on. And there was a lot of, at that time, I think with the urban migrants moving back to rural areas, but even many studies have shown that during COVID, in order to survive, even these domestic workers, people living in slums, actually they ended up selling off their assets, and larger part of it was women's assets in terms of jewelry. And this, of course, meant, enhanced stress across categories, because the responsibility for feeding the family in terms of the gender division of labor is on women. When you don't have money, you can't purchase commodities. This is also one reason where a lot of middle-class women got interested in urban farming, because really you have to put the food on the table. And with things getting so expensive, how do you manage a limited household budget? Children were off school, Anganwadis were closed, and of course, this meant also increasing work days for women, rising incidents of violence, and also the possibility of risky and undesirable practices. My last point really is that when we talk about cities, I think we often imagine metros or large cities, but cities also vary in terms of the effects of urbanization across locations. So I've been doing some work in coastal areas in Tamil Nadu, and this is a picture from Kadalur district. Kadalur is one of the most urbanized coastal towns or cities, if you like, in Tamil Nadu. Right from the 1970s, 80s, there has been a lot of industrialization, which has meant thermal power plant, chemical industries, which has meant both building of infrastructure and pipes to put waste and effluents into the sea, not proper treatment often because of corruption, other kinds of things. But what this has meant is a pollution of nearshore waters, a decline in fish catch, and which again has impacts on women. Because this fish catch, not everybody is a vendor, but I think women did access this fish catch both for a sale, but also for consumption at home every day. This was a very important part of their nutrition and diet. And now that is kind of gone. There is very little accessible to them. So I think we also need to look at specifics and specific impacts on inclusion and exclusion of gender, but also of other kinds of groups in different ecosystems. So coastal is one. Similarly, mountains. We've heard about the big crisis in Uttarakhand, the recent floods and so on because of climate change. But this is also, worse affected by the kind of reckless urbanization and construction that is taking place in these places. So I think my last is really about policy standards. I think apart from other things, we need data which is relevant, which is disaggregated, which ensures that women and excluded groups' voices are heard across different domains when we are planning for climate action. Secondly, finance is very important. And I made this point earlier, but we have been working with some colleagues on an analysis of state action plans in India, and 28 states we have looked at, and most of them treat women in a very homogeneous way, and their strategies are quite gender blind. I think there are a few, and we did not look at implementation. We just looked at the plans. Uttarakhand, Chhattisgarh, Nagaland, Bihar seem to have slightly more progressive gender action plans, which at least take account of different kinds of women. And this is possibly because of a lot of discussion in the formulation of these plans between different kinds of stakeholders. So my last point is really about inclusion and equity in terms of representation, in terms of framing the discussion, framing the discourse. From whose perspective are we framing this discourse? So a neoliberal growth agenda tends to focus more on resource exploitation and extraction rather than on social or gender justice. I've tried to give some examples of the trade-offs, even in the context of urban and peri-urban agriculture, between social goals and economic goals. So this is a trade-off, and certain choices, certain perspectives have to be prioritized. Second is redistribution remains very important. That I ask the question that, with urbanization, is there a further marginalization of some kinds of women, like in the coastal town of Kadalur that I showed you the picture? And finally, there is a broader sort of ethical point about really who is planning for, who is state policy for, are all citizens really considered equally in our planning processes? Thanks very much, Bhargavi.
Thank you, Nithya Rao, for highlighting all the inequality that is happening in the context of women, especially the unequal urban spaces, access to jobs. You practically covered everything, both in the rural and the urban landscapes, and how women's work is devalued, and the nature of work that is allotted to women. And now with the smart city programs coming in, with a lot of technology being pushed everywhere, women seem to stand in a place where they're going to lose out on that little bit of work that they have. Even the simple mechanization of little things is being taken over by men. So we'll hold our thoughts on that, and we'll listen to Soumya Da. And after Soumya Datta's talk, we will take questions. So over to Soumya Datta.
Thank you, Bhargavi. Thank you, People Resource Center, for initiating this timely discussion. It's very timely because I just want to, and to begin with, let me explain some of the points that I thought I will talk about. It has covered some of these. Of course, that's to be expected because many of these are the critical points that we are thinking about. But let me start with a little bit of perspective. In fact, the urbanization, the very urbanization process started with on the farming surplus. And that process started when the earth was coming out of the younger droughts. That's a climate change. The last major climate change that the earth faced, we faced this transition from hunter-gatherer to agriculture, and then as a result of the farming surplus, urbanization. And the entire history of urbanization going back to roughly 10,000 years, starting with Jericho and then Eridu and all this, shows that very clearly that agriculture was in the periphery. Agriculture was not in the city or in the town, but agriculture was in the periphery. But during those periods, it was never far removed, never disconnected. So that's one critical point that we have seen. And today we are talking about the urbanization, urban settlements, and farming, that is food production. Farming is not only agriculture, but it's food production. So that we are talking about also in the context of another kind of climate crisis, which is this time it's caused by basically a systemic crisis. I'll not call it anthropogenic, but it's a systemic crisis. Some of the points that I also was hearing occasionally, not the entire discussion earlier, in the earlier sessions, I also just want to point out that many of the time it has been pointed out or told that cities, cities do consume, cities are not the producers. Cities originated as producers of secondary goods, often, mostly secondary goods. Cities still are producers, but what is happening over the last few decades with wealth accumulating in cities, and all of us know most of the wealth, whether you take the entire world or you take India or similar developing economies or in the third world or in the southern hemisphere, global south, you get the same kind of data that the maximum amount of economic gain out of all economic activities is coming into the hands of cities, is accumulating in cities. And this is one important aspect that I want to point out later on in connection with urban farming. That's why I wanted to highlight this aspect. And there are several mechanisms in India, in South Asian countries, and in developing countries. And here I want to also point out that it was excellent to listen to Logan's presentation. We know of hundreds, maybe thousands of initiatives all over Europe, US. In fact, there's localization, local farming, farmers markets, lot of this, whether it's in the urban areas or in the peri-urban areas. But there is a clear difference between the kind of urbanization that the global south is now going through and the kind of urbanization that is more stable and more sort of consolidated, class consolidated urbanization that has happened in the Europe or USA or in the richer countries, which are developing, howsoever you want to define them. So there are clear differences, and those are points that we need to understand if we have to work on this in our kind of context. It's not only in India, but most developing countries, most countries like India is just coming out of the low income to low medium income. So many of the economies are in that situation, many of the countries are in that situation. So this is one important aspect that I will later on point out. Let me just quickly come to what we are talking about, the context, the climate crisis, the present climate crisis, which is basically greenhouse gas emission, as Nithya said, but the driving factor is that our consumptions, our kind of consumption, the sources of our energy and material consumption, and the resulting emissions from that kind of consumption. It's not only a model of urbanization, it's a model of kind of energy, kind of consumption that we have. It's not only financial, it's beyond that. So obviously there is a consequence on the global climate and on people. And let me quickly point out, in my work and our groups, different groups works over the last around 17, 18 years with communities, with different countries, mostly in South Asia, but also in other countries, whatever little I have worked with, few African countries and Latin America. We have seen, particularly in developing and poorer economies, poorer countries, there are 4 groups of people that we are seeing who are impacted the most by the climate extreme and the climate change impacts. One is the mountain communities. Second is the coastal communities. These two Nithya also spoke about. The third category of people are marginal and small farmers. And the fourth category of people are the communities who are most severely impacted are urban poor. So in India and similar kind of economies, urban poor is one of the most severely impacted communities, but they are almost invisible in terms of climate impacts, the climate, quote unquote, climate change impacts. For your information, many of us have stopped officially mentioning climate change. We call it climate crisis, because from the perspective of those communities, it's really a crisis. And maybe for all of us, very soon it's going to be a real crisis. That's what we are seeing in the science of this. So in this, what we are seeing is not only the kind of things that have been mentioned, there are several other impacts which are connected to farming, agriculture, food production. Here, let me also go into what kind of impacts have already happened. It's not that things will happen in the coming decades, they will intensify, but things that are already happening for the last 3.5 decades. One thing that has happened clearly is what we call temporal and spatial disruption in water availability, where it has to be, it was supposed to rain, at what point of time it was supposed to rain. So those kind of things have gone haywire. We have also heard in the other morning or maybe yesterday's session that there will be impacts on monsoon. It is not that there will be. The IMD, the India Meteorological Department's 100-year monsoon study clearly showed that the monsoon rains, not only the monsoon rains, the total rainfall, total precipitation over India average has not changed much. There are spatial differentiation, different regions have got difference in that. Whatever earlier they used to get, some are getting less, some are getting more. But the higher impact is because of concentration of rainfall days. 35 to 40 years ago, what used to be the total rainfall used to be distributed between 43 to 45 days in a year. Now the same amount of rainfall is coming down, more or less the same amount of rainfall is coming down in 23 to 25 days. So when it rains, it really pours. And in between, there are dry periods. So farming has been impacted very badly, but it's not only farming. One of the regions that has been impacted very badly, and in 2-3 what we call jatras in the Himalaya, with the jatra with Himalaya Nithya Rao, we found 700 small streams and sort of rivulets dried up. So these are not major rivers, but these are the water sources, drinking water sources for most mountain villages and many of the small mountain towns. There is a massive impact on this, and as a result, there is also a massive impact on mountain agriculture. In mountain agriculture, as all of us know, it's in India particularly, it's terrace, it's very small, very, very little of irrigation, very local water harvesting, whether even if it is exists. So those kind of, and these are basically dependent on what they call sroth, khad or sroth. These are the local terms for the rivulets and streams. These have been impacted the most. You don't see that kind of impact so much visibly on the major rivers. These are impacted, but the small resources or mountain villages and towns, this has got impacted tremendously. The other area, as Nithya also mentioned, in the coastal areas, in my work with coastal communities, one of the major losses that I am seeing, I have been working with Bangladesh and Indian communities, coastal communities. Both communities are facing major amount of land losses because of erosion, because of more stronger storm surges. So these two are causing a massive impact, not only the productivity loss because of salinization, because of saline ingress, but also because of net loss of land every year. There are villages which loses 50 to 100 hectares of land every year. I have just come back last year from Sundarbans, both in England, India and Bangladesh. There are villages and towns, and those kind of things are becoming every year, not once in a century or once in a decade kind of happening. Those are happening regularly. But let me also quickly, without going into that, let me quickly also come down. What are the impacts that urban consumption and urban sort of, as a result of urban consumption, emission and urban activities, urban economic activities, what are the kind of impacts different communities are getting, and how urban farming is tied into that? Because the whole series is named Farming the City. So as I said, one is the climate impacts, which is the physical change in the climate. But the second thing that is happening, as I said, is the water cycle. Water cycle, the hydrological cycle is impacted, is getting impacted the first and the severest. What is, as a result, what I said is are not only urban communities, even rural communities are getting tremendously impacted. But the other thing that is happening, see, as an urban community, whatever we consume, particularly the food, everything that you consume, do not only have a carbon footprint, it also has a water footprint. Every kg of rice that we consume has roughly 1400 kg of water footprint. Every jeans pant, a pair of jeans pant that we, jeans trouser that we wear, over a life cycle, that's roughly, average is 13,000 kgs of water. So the more the urban consumption is growing, because the wealth creation, economic gains are getting concentrated in urban centers, consumption is gaining in the urban centers, and as a result, consumption of water both in terms of explicit water and in terms of embedded water, is rapidly increasing. The amount of electricity consumption that has gone up in India's urban centers and everywhere else, I'm talking about India and South Asia more because we work in this region, the amount of electricity consumption that got up and gone up, and the major part is from coal and gas and nuclear. Nuclear does not contribute too much, but coal contributes roughly 67 to 68% of the electricity. Come down recently a little, but still over 65%. And every megawatt hour of coal power consumes around 5,000 liters of water as a consumptive use, apart from the thermal pollution and chemical pollution. So these kind of urban consumption, it's not only physical impact on the climate change, on the climate, but it's also a direct impact on the water availability of the rural hinterland, and also the water availability in the urban poor communities. If we give an example of Delhi, over the last few years, Delhi's situation has changed because of a policy, as all of you know, Aam Aadmi Party's policy, but still not every urban poor community has got that access. But before that, the equation was more like this. Several urban communities in Delhi used to get something like 450 to 500 liters per day per person. And poor urban communities in Mehrauli and everywhere else used to get 30 to 50 liters per person per day. So that was the kind of inequity that existed within the urban area. Forget about the rural areas. Right now, this year, somehow the monsoon is pre-monsoon showers are happening in South India. Otherwise, by mid-April, roughly 200 districts of India used to face severe water crisis. It's not only the heat stress, along with the heat stress, is severe water crisis. And a large part of this water crisis connects with urban water consumption, direct and indirect. As I said, explicit water consumption. If I give an example of Delhi, Delhi's water supply is something like 1,100 million gallons per day. 1,100 million gallons. Out of that, 84% comes from the Jamuna Canal and the Ganga Canal. That means there's roughly around 850 million gallons of water every day Delhi sucks in from its rural hinterland. That's the explicit water. And every consumption Delhi, I'm not saying Delhi is the only bad city. All cities do that. So I'm giving Delhi's example because we have worked with Delhi's governance, Delhi's civil society, Delhi's resident welfare associations, this kind of groups. Delhi's consumption of food, consumption of clothes, consumption of power, that has a much larger than this 850 million gallons per day water footprint. Again, that water comes from rural hinterland. So this is a grave injustice that the cities do. It's not only they emit the carbon dioxide and the methane and everything, so that the climate impact hits the rural poor, the farmers and the mountain communities and the coastal communities. In doing this consumption, they also suck in the water. So the rural communities actually are subsidizing their water in this age of water shortage, because all of us probably know that India is now, as a whole, as a country, India is water stressed. We have gone up to, our availability is around 1,450 cubic meters per person per year. And UN categorizes any society that has access to less than 1,700 cubic meter per person per year as water stressed, and 1,000 or less is water scarce. So we are not into water scarce as India, but roughly 150 districts of India is water scarce, already are water scarce. They go into water scarcity, and that's visible every summer when April starts. So those, in that kind of a situation, the urban consumption of water is increasing for all kinds of direct, the explicit water, and the implicit or embedded water. So that's a concern. And here I would like to put a little bit of caution. I'm all for urban farming. I'm an enthusiast. When I was in Kolkata, our house, I was the only brother out of 3 brothers who used to do farming. I used to grow 4 to 5 kinds of vegetables and at least 4 kinds of fruits. But let me also put a few points of caution. There are other issues where urban centers are sucking in resources. The amount of vegetable matter, grown matter, the food and the clothing, the fiber that we consume, it do not go back to the soil. After independence in the decade of 50s, average figure for Central Indian and North Indian soil, the soil organic carbon content was something like 0.82 to 0.85%. today, that same figure is 0.5, or in some places it's even lower. What is happening is, it's not only the soil organic carbon content, it's all nutrient contents of the soil. It's coming out as food and fiber, getting consumed in the urban centers, getting dumped in the urban centers, not going back to the rural areas, not going back to the soil, not replenishing the soil. Just telling the rural people that why are you burning your stock? You should compost it, doesn't work. A huge amount of biological matter comes out of that soil, comes into the cities. The nutrients don't go back to the rural areas. It dumped in the cities, it generates methane, and it creates further problem of climate change. So I think what I'll say in that term, one, we need to look into the integration of how not only urban farming will serve the need of the urban, as everybody probably now in this session is saying, not except Logan, because the context of European and US and developed country cities are quite different. But as Nithya said, I was also pointing out that in the urban poor, our realities are roughly 40 to 50% of our urban population live in urban informal settlements, which have very little space, not even rooftop space in most places. And even if they have a very little rooftop space, they will like to put it for some kind of residential or other use. So the kind of urban farming that we are now seeing is basically the privileged class. I'll not say middle and upper middle, both are in a sense, if you go into India's economic sense, it's a privileged class. The other class, which includes this 40 to 50% of urban people and roughly around 85 to 90% of rural people, they often have to pay the price of the consumption and the luxuries and the fancies of the urban and very thin rural privileged class and the now substantial urban privileged class. And this is another area where the environmental politics is also shifting. If you look at the environmental politics, which is dominated by urban youth and urban classes with voice, with political and media voice, you'll see most of the dialogue like this: farmers are burning stock, so penalize them, they should be given. We don't see that the stock burning, out of 5 independent studies, 5 independent scientific studies, the total pollution content, PM 2.5 and PM 10 of stock burning is 3 to 8% of Delhi's pollution or North Indian urban pollution. So those get sidelined. The privileged class environmental politics is dominating this discourse, whether it is environmentalism, whether it is urban farming. So here, let me give a very little caution. Again, please don't misunderstand me. I am all for urban farming, but let me give a caution. I think all people involved in this forum, Rajendra Ravi and all, they will love to have every urban family do some urban farming. But unfortunately, let me not use that term. Farming needs a lot of water. If Delhi already sucks in something like 850 million gallons per day of explicit water and 1,000 million gallons more plus of embedded water from the rural areas, are this extra farming water going to come from those same rural hinterlands? Are we going to pauperize in terms of water availability the rural hinterlands more so that the urban privileged class can have access to their homegrown vegetable? I'm not saying this is necessary. What I'm saying is there are ways to minimize that. The going gaga, taking it in a, what I will give a warning is don't oversimplify the issues. There are positive factors of urban farming, but in our kind of situation, you have to understand the context, you have to understand the power relationships, you have to understand the exchange mechanism. What we have, the kind of exchange mechanisms our politics and economics has established, it's a very unequal exchange mechanism. We pay very little for the food, water, air, everything, the nutrients that we take from the rural areas. We charge a much higher premium, whatever the urban societies and the urban communities produce, whether it is telephone services, whether it is education services, whether it is health services, or whether it is just certification, because this has become a big business now. Certify, organic food certify, you are Sigma this certify. And this is entirely the urban economies are also going more into this kind of scheming of the producers. The secondary production function of urban areas is going down. The tertiary services and financialization, scheming of the economic gains from all other sectors is increasing. And this is a trend which goes very well with urban consumption increase. If you look at all cities, the cities which has become wealthy doing this kind of financial and tertiary services, their consumption levels have gone up tremendously. Whether it is Europe, whether it is US or in India. Because if you look at Mumbai and Delhi, these two cities per capita solid waste generation, Mumbai and Delhi sits on top. Bangalore is catching up fast, Hyderabad is catching up fast. But Mumbai and Delhi, Mumbai sits on top, Delhi is the second. So whether we want to go without those kind of analysis, without the glaring inequities between the cities and the rural hinterlands that they suck in from, whether we don't want to look into the glaring inequities within the cities where 40 to 50% of the urban residents, they won't have access to urban farming. They still have to buy either contaminated food or higher priced food coming from outside. And we'll still promote only the individual or small farm or enterprise kind of thing, or we'll go for public farming. There could be a public urban farming approach, which I have not seen much, but I suggest that if something positive as a policy recommendation, as a guideline, or as a directional push, if this forum needs to get out, I think these two aspects also needs to be taken into account, while urban farming needs to be encouraged, because that also reduces the carbon and water footprint that the cities have apparently. But the water, water and nutrient, if it has to come from the same rural hinterland, then the equation do not change. In fact, there is another point that I want to just highlight briefly. The kind of very, very unequal exchanges that we have brought in. The rural areas, which are the primary producers, which primarily produces the food items, the photosynthetic products. They produce the photosynthesis and their resultant products. They are at a disadvantage to the producers who do the secondary and tertiary production. Secondary production and tertiary production of services, because it is very unequal exchange. But it is in unequal exchange not only in terms of money. It is unequal exchange also in terms of other things, water and nutrients, as I said. Plus, what is the mechanism today that in our kind of cities, to some extent, this tremendous disparity in economic position is met or equalized to a little extent, not equalized, but reduced to a little extent. What are the mechanisms that the rural people get access to a little bit of the urban wealth accumulation, the urban economic gains? One primary source is production of vegetables and fruits and food production. So that food production, they do the production, sold to the urban areas. The urban people have a better economic access. They buy, and a part of that urban economic gain and urban wealth flows back to the rural areas. The second mechanism is migratory labor. So these two are the major mechanisms by which the very, very unequal, very, very concentrated economic gain, wealth accumulation in the urban centers flows back a little to the rural areas. If we are thinking, supposing, hypothetically, every urban family grows their own vegetables and fruits. So we don't buy vegetables and fruit from the world. I'm not saying this will happen. I'm saying hypothetical. That will be many urban farmer enthusiasts have talked. When I talk to them, they have, so if every family could have produced their own vegetables and fruits, that would have been so good. But then what are we talking about? Are we saying that the rural hinterland will only be relegated to producing the lower economic value cereals and others, and the higher economic value fruits and vegetables will all be produced within the city? I'm not, again, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not against urban farming, but I'm saying don't oversimplify the issues. There are a lot of inequity issues. There are a lot of hidden embedded consumption and deprivation issues, discrimination issues. So unless we also tackle those, just saying that people in the city should do their own farming won't help much. We'll have little bit of urban upper middle class people having quote unquote uncontaminated vegetables, quote unquote, they're fresh vegetables. They will be very happy. Those are not small gains, but then the inequity might also be increased. So let's support urban farming, but let's also think what are the kind of policy directions, what are the kind of guidelines, what are the kind of advocacy points that we can generate for this kind of a campaign, which is needed for tackling the climate crisis. But understanding that the climate crisis is very, very differentiated. It's not only gender differentiated, it's completely differentiated between economic classes. If you have more resources, you are less vulnerable, very clear. So that is, there are n number of studies and n number of practical examples that we have seen ourselves. I have worked with right after the Uttarakhand disaster, after the disaster in West Bengal, after Amphan destroyed something like 10.5 lakh houses. And those are issues that needs to be taken care of. But then the urban farming, well, this is good as an initiative. The present direction seems to be a little devoid of deeper analysis and devoid of little sort of not looking at the deeper connections and the implications. This can be possibly can be a win-win situation, but as of now, there are large gap areas. So I'll end here. Maybe if there are questions, because I know I might have provoked some people. That was a purpose of provoking some people, because though just saying that urban farming is very good and very good things are happening, and there are lots of examples. Let me just add on to this, that not only hydroponics, aeroponics, hydroponics, aquaponics, the Cuban example of organoponics or organiponicos, as they call, there are thousands and thousands of examples. In Cuba's case, it was much better because an entire society was forced into that. In our case, the inequities in our urban and rural and intra-urban situations are very, very large. So that introduces additional complexities, additional problems. Let's look into those also, and then devise our strategies. Thank you.
Thank you, Samyadatta, for that very thought-provoking talk. You highlighted some very important issues in the context of the global south, especially the kind of urbanization we are seeing today, where most of our commons are gone, and the peripheries of our city are constantly, there are spaces for contestations everywhere. Everywhere we seem to be fighting off real estate agents and big land sharks and big kind of infrastructure development or gated community development. You brought in some very important points in the context of the urban poor and the accessibility to resources for them, and finally who will possibly benefit from this kind of urban farming. While you were talking, it also helped me think about Bangalore itself. So, for example, in Bangalore, many of our commons, the lakes particularly, were used by the local communities for fishing, because the lakes were given out for lease for fishing communities, and the banks of the lake were farmed during the dry months, because the lakes in Bangalore are they have water from the monsoon and beyond, and during the summer months the water line recedes, and that's when local communities, they used to farm on that. But now many of these lakes largely cater to the recreational needs of the urban community, and farming practices have completely stopped. Fishing happens in very few places, not everywhere. And also we've put a whole lot of urban parks, again for recreational purposes in Bangalore. And if you go around Bangalore, you will see that all these parks have ornamental plants and not one edible plant anywhere. And again, all these ornamental plants are water guzzlers and pesticide guzzlers. So that just kind of made me think whether those could be the possible places for this kind of urban farming. So with these thoughts, we will take some questions now. I also had a question to Logan. I was just wondering, how did you all even start that entire initiative? How did the conversation start? And how did you manage to bridge the urban and the rural? And what were the challenges you all faced in the initial days?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. So I was already working on the farm, but I was still living in the city. And this was about 10 years ago. And Budapest at that time was very there was an underlying creative culture, a creative conscious culture. And at that time, still, one of the positives in the city was that space for a non-traditional business or organization was still quite accessible as far as having a headquarters for a social organization, because the property values and pricing at that time didn't start to skyrocket from tourism yet. So there was a lot of people doing things and experimenting. And I was participating in these different communities, social activists, environmental activists, urban gardeners, artisans and craftspeople, carpenters, bike makers. It's not a very large community in Hungary, but it's a community that if you're active in it, you get to know each other quite well because you ran into each other in similar social spaces. So with a group of people who were mostly my friends and colleagues in the city, we started thinking, how can we try to link up these individual activities which we're participating in? So I had the direct connection to the farm because I was already working there. I also knew bike builders and some people working as cargo bike messengers. I also knew some researchers from different universities and some other friends who were working with the zero waste and more livable city movement. And so to make a direct correlation between a bicycle cooperative and a farm in the countryside, there's not necessarily a direct link, but there's a lot of crossover in values as far as wanting to reduce our environmental footprint, wanting to have more socially linked interaction and actually create the true community. So not just an urban environment where we're living as strangers amongst each other, but where we're living, talking, interacting together about both the things that we like and also the challenges that we face. So we designed Cargonomia about being as much as what we do directly, we also try to serve as a network for empowering other initiatives in the city as well. So besides the direct events that we organize on the farm or in a public space in the city, we really work hard to help link other organizations together and encourage them to cooperate. Because the atmosphere for existing as a civic organization in Hungary is not necessarily the most helpful. And we really need to rely on our own resources and even their strength in remaining independent from being reliant on foreign funding or even national funding. So the original idea was taking advantage of the creative social network and also finding linkages between different organizations and realizing that we have a strength working together instead of struggling independently. And that's how the idea started, and it led to a lot of beyond the first ideas we had, it led to a lot of other correlations with other social and civic groups happening. So it snowballed into a quite influential network in both the rural and the urban community as well. And since then, we've been continuing to experiment in what are new types of projects that we can have and who else we can provide support to.
Thank you, Logan. There's actually a question for Logan since you've just spoken about it. I will start with the question for you. So Rosama Thomas says, this is so impressive. How old is the farm and does the manure of any animals of pastoral communities used here? And she also asked, does Bill Gates have a role in Hungary health or agriculture policy?
So the farm itself is has been surviving self-sufficiently for 10 years now. My supervisor who started the farm has been an organic gardener in Hungary for more than 25 years. We're very influenced by biodynamic agriculture and agroecology with a mix of permaculture at a market garden scale as well. Enhancing our soil and preserving the quality of soil is the key element of what we're doing. It's a very unique choice that we make to make and manage our own compost. I didn't want to go too technically into the process of making and managing compost, but it's really, really key for us. We use a mixture of horse manure, cow manure, and vegetable remains, which are all the source of all of these is the village and where the farm is. And this is a really unique choice, even in organic agriculture. Most people are buying soil supplements, which very likely are a product of conventional agriculture. And that's a big contradiction, especially if we're taking an agroecology approach, to be mining or finding a source of soil nutrients from a distant location. If we truly want to start speaking about closed loop agriculture, or closing the loop of nutrients on a farm, the farm needs to be the source of, the farm needs to have a source of base nutrients which it can return to the soil, especially when we're asking a lot of it by intensively producing on a small area. So this is quite a difficult choice, to make and manage your own high quality compost as well, but it's a key goal of ours, and we actually work really hard to try to promote knowledge of producing high quality compost without machines at a small scale as well. And we're always reading. So you could look at our farm, and we're using mostly hand machines. We're still working with horses, and someone might say it's old fashioned, but we're doing composting techniques which are traditional but very modernized as well. There's a lot of interesting research about mycorrhiza bacteria and the benefits to life in the soil based on the type of compost that you're returning to the soil. And we're following all of the up-to-date research on this, because the knowledge of soil, even though we know quite a lot, we still probably don't know more than we already know about soil life. So we're trying to follow this as much as possible. And as far as whether Bill Gates has any involvement in Hungary, I'm not aware of it. I would personally be happy if he kind of stayed outside of Hungary and let Hungarians kind of manage and make decisions on the environmental movement on their own. I am aware of his projects, but we don't have any. We value our own independence and self-sufficiency, because just to comment a bit on, this type of agriculture, it shouldn't only exist with funding support. We can't support organic agriculture with the leftover profit from exploitative industries. It should stand on its own feet, and it can. And that's what we work. It's also a primary goal of ours to be financially independent, to not only survive through subsidy, because we all know of the problematic nature of subsidy, and especially the fact that most of it is directly supporting a destructive type of agriculture, both socially and environmentally. So we want to work to prove that an alternative approach to agriculture can thrive and support itself, and not only be propped up by the donations from exploitative industries.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Priya Banerjee. Priya, do you want to ask your question? Is it to Logan or to Soumya Datta?
Good evening to everyone. It's just a general question, like which sort of plants can be grown easily in households? Because in urban spaces, mostly we have space crunches, and also it's difficult to meet specific requirement for a number of crops or plants that we grow. So some crops examples, if any of the speakers can provide, which could be easily harvested using hydroponics or aquaponics or something like that.
This is very easy. In fact, a lot of people, even in India, has done, and Delhi also has done. Which city you are located in?
I'm presently located in Kolkata.
Okay. In fact, in almost all cities, there is a very old, 50 years plus, the Association of Kitchen Gardens of India. Earlier, probably it was known as Kitchen Garden Association of India. So they promote they have a lot of literatures in what kind of climate, Indian cities climate, what kind of crops will be, what kind of vegetables will be better done. But normally what we have seen, and I have also done, but a lot of our friends have done, both in pots and in hydroponics. And hydroponics means just in bottles. That has also been done, not expensive hydroponics. See, these are tomatoes, chili, some places also this Bhindi, which is ladyfinger. This kind of crops grow very well. Palak, particularly the leafy vegetables grow very well, very easily, without much trouble. But tomato, chili, these are also very easily grown. But I'll suggest that since every city, almost every big city has this Kitchen Garden Association, some kind of a group or office, you can also talk to them because they can also do the initial handholding.
Thank you. Thank you, Soumya Datta. I was wondering, Nithya, you spoke about all the state action plans. So with the possibility of, we've heard such fantastic examples from Syria and the Kurdish examples, such as in Rojava. Is there a possibility that we can ensure 50% women's participation everywhere?
So I think, I was just having a conversation yesterday that when we look at the rural context, women have been at the front line. And it's not only 50%, it would be 70%, 80%. Actually, yesterday I was having a discussion which we want to take to the UN Food System Summit as well with activists and others. But if you look at any rural context in India, women's agency, and somebody in the morning, I think Parama mentioned SHGs and so on. I think these are the social capital. This is the central, which is actually trying to adapt, which is mitigating, which is taking on measures, partly in the context of India because of male migration, because agriculture of the, unequal exchange relations between agriculture and industry, which Soumya mentioned. So I think that, I would say that actually women have to be at the center of this. And this is also a big divide between urban and rural when we talk about divides, because in the rural, I think it's increasingly recognized that in the agriculture sector, because when you go to the rural, you mostly see women. If you go to the mountains, Almora, I was there last week, it's mostly women because the men are not there. They're all migrant to cities. So we are dependent on them. We are strengthening them. We are creating supportive policies for livelihoods. But when it comes to the urban, I think this divide is really getting, this inequality or this divide is just getting so much more sharper because absolutely there's no attention. There's no organization. I think it's more difficult to organize. You don't have SHGs in urban areas. You don't have sources of credit. I mean, I saw in the context of COVID even that, women in urban areas, they were like borrowing money from moneylenders at like 10% interest just to run the household when their husbands lost their jobs. And I think this backup support, this idea of community, of people to support you, of social capital, I think this is completely collapsed in urban areas. It's got very individualized. It's about individual consumption. I don't bother about my neighbor. What I do, does it positively or negatively affect my neighbor? And I think here we really need a change in, in ethics, in culture, in, bringing back some of those social institutions, because as long as people are in rural, they're practicing some of those social institutions. You can't go against everybody else. You'll get the headman or the sarpanch will immediately say that, you can't do this. It's adversely affecting somebody else. If I let my cows out to graze when other people are cultivating, it's not done. So there are certain rules and norms for the collective good which are practiced. I think when you move to the urban, it becomes a free for all. Even if you look at waste you were talking about earlier, you may maintain your house clean, but the whole tragedy of India is that the street outside your house, you just put the dump of all your household waste, on the street in front, rather than actually making attention to cleanliness of the neighborhood, or hygiene of the neighborhood and so on. I'm not bothered. I'm bothered about my own health and hygiene, not about the neighbor. And I think this is where women suffer, because the thing is that a lot of the activities which they do are based on sharing, on collective, like in an urban context, water collection. If it's a slum, then it's a common water point. You have to queue up there, you have to stand, you have to collect, you have to share and make sure that others also get. But these kind of, values somehow are not getting kind of recognized. I think when I was talking about lack of recognition and devaluation, not only of work, but I think also of values and of collective systems of sharing and so on. It's so much polarized between the capitalist society. I think that capitalism does that, a free market fundamentalism, that it makes you think about your individual needs rather than about the collective. So at a little level, I think the hope that I see is, women are still in the urban context, at least seen as responsible for their household. It's like all this urban farming, including amongst the middle classes, and they're doing it from a sense of, okay, I'll feed my children fresh produce, or I'll do something for my family if I can't earn an income. So there's a bit of altruism, if you like, still there, but we are not harnessing it for the purposes of the larger problem of the city, or of improving or addressing this climate crisis in the city. So I think, women have to be at the front line. I mean, to answer your question in one word, I think in the rural they are in the front line of addressing the climate crisis. And I think in the urban also, we have to recognize them, we have to give them the voice and the value and the representation to be at the front line of addressing the climate crisis.
Bhargavi, if I can just come in for a couple of minutes.
Sure, Soumya.
Because this point that you raised is very important in terms of if any group or any sort of collective is interested now, because we started intervening in the SAPCCs, the State Action Plan on Climate Change, in 2010. And we were able to, at that time, the states were refusing to even tell you what is their plan. No, it's a government plan, why should we tell you? Kind of attitude. So we were first successful in breaking into Manipur, then 8 states, including Uttarakhand, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, UP, Rajasthan, Maharashtra once. No, not Maharashtra. Maharashtra did refuse. So now, right now, there is an opportunity to intervene in this because the state action plans are supposed to be revised periodically. So right now, starting late 2019, the first revision of state action plans is going on. They are supposed to be over by 2020, but 2020 not much happened. So most of the state action plans are now in the process of revision, and some states are including new theme areas. So any group with a reasonably clear understanding, if they want to intervene, like I'm helping some of our the SAPAC groups, the South Asian People's Action groups, to help intervene in the Maharashtra state action. It's a fight because some moneyed groups, some very well-funded NGOs, they have got better connection with the government, but still, if you can bring in a lot of people's voices, people's groups into this right now, there is a chance that some kind of changes can take place in the SAPCCs, because once they are finalized, the final draft comes out and the government notifies them in its website, then it will be much more difficult to change them. So right now there is a good chance that if some groups collective together, not one single group maybe, intervene in their state action plans, some kind of changes might be accepted. The second thing that I will take up from Nithya's, and I also said this, mentioned this, that even when we are talking about urban farming, can we think of less of an individualized farming? Like I said, public, why can't there be public urban farming? Like I always thought about this, I talked to a lot of people here, why do cities don't have mangoes, guavas, jackfruits, all these trees? They are planting trees, they are maintaining trees with municipal, that means public money. But if you have, say, 2 million mango and guava and jackfruit, and so those are not trees, in any kind of food or nutritional shortage crisis, like happened in the COVID crisis, the urban poor could have access to something, some little bit. The urban middle class, upper class didn't really face much difficulty. We have seen many places. They were actually sort of putting social media message of what do I cook today, this or that. Whereas the urban poor were saying what do I cook today, because there is nothing. So that kind of situation could have been avoided. So maybe when we talk about urban farming also in this context, rather than focusing so much on my rooftop, my terrace, which is not bad, I'm not saying stop that, that's there. But as a group, can we focus more on the policy push support for larger public urban farming, which food produces food? So that will be, I think, I have not seen any city that doing that, but that will be a good kind of initiative, intervention.
Yeah, very true, Soumya. Yes. I saw Mohini's hand go up. Mohini, are you still here? Yeah. Mohini, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah. So my question is to Soumya. I totally agree with what he said about moving beyond this environmental romanticism, which has been kind of a niche for privileged class, and like look at the systemic changes. Also, in terms of the contestation over the about the claim over the urban spaces, which kind of excludes the urban poor from practicing such kind of environmentalism. So I wanted to ask whether urban farming has been like so far tokenist environmentalism, by which kind of urban rich just wash off their guilt of consuming much more resources. Like we have so far talked about only food consumption, but I think that is the kind of consumption we can do little about. I mean, reducing it is kind of a bit difficult. Rather than how can, but the much larger part of consumption, which has much larger environmental impacts, is kind of brushed aside. So like, has urban farming so far been an attempt to move our gaze from this kind of consumption, which in terms of maybe electronic goods, clothes, everything, and not focus, like move our focus away from it? And also, like if yes, then how can we integrate it to this larger question? My second question is, like, you talked about policy push a lot, but you also talked about systemic changes. So do you think that policy push can really lead towards systemic changes? Because then policies are, of course, the kind of whatever governments wants to do, it makes policy according to it. So do you think that it can really lead to systemic changes?
Answering your first question, see, I don't think this is a sort of washing of guilt. The way urban farming initiatives are happening, these are happening with good intentions. Good intentions by good people. But the only point I highlighted is there are larger issues which urban farming enthusiasts and groups are not looking at. Like I gave some examples. If supposing Delhi has something like 4 to 4.5 million families, households, not families, households. Supposing 2 million households start doing farming on their rooftops or terraces, and every family needs, say, something like 50 to 100 liters a day with reasonable farming, then that induces, say, 100 to 200 million liters extra per day. Where does that water come from? So those kind of issues needs to be also taken into account. Plus the question I talked about, the unequal exchange, the mechanism of unequal exchange, very, very unequal exchange between rural and urban. The produce that comes from rural areas are valued at a very low price, very low exchange value, whereas the produce that we come out with in the urban areas are valued at a much higher exchange value. So those kind of issues needs to be looked into. That's what my point was that it's not that people who are doing urban farming or pushing urban farming are trying to wash away guilt. Not at all. But I don't at all feel that, because that kind of thing I have not seen. But the larger question of whether urban privileged class is trying to shift the environmental damage blame to the rural areas, yes, that's happening to a very significant extent. And I have given 2 examples, like this stock burning is one example. Yamuna water pollution is another example. You know, Yamuna, Delhi has 2% of the stretch of Yamuna. And entire pollution load of Yamuna, 73 to 75% comes from Delhi, 72 to 75%. But the entire discourse that you hear is because of Haryana and upstream, they do contribute, I'm not denying. But because of Haryana and Punjab Punjab farmers use so much of pesticide, Yamuna is polluted. Yamuna is polluted. But far greater pollution load is added in Delhi by the urban center. So those kind of privileged class environmental politics is very clear. Like if you see any media dialogue on air pollution, we'll talk about every 4th or 5th sentence, it will talk about parali jala raha, stock burning. So that's not the major issue, but that's the dominant issue in the discourse. So those kind of privileged class environmental politics, we should be very clear on. That is the point that I wanted to keep. What was the second point? Just one.
The policy push and policy push and the systemic change.
I recollect. See, systemic change will not happen just by advocacy. But advocacy, forget about the present government. I don't think anything will happen with the present government. Even half the country's population writing to them will not change anything. But in the past, we have seen that this kind of activism, where large number of people were mobilized, their voices were collected and put out to the so-called decision makers, there were changes. In fact, if you recollect, if all of us recollect, the Right to Information Act, the Food Security Act, the Manrega, everything came out not because the government wanted, But because a very large number of people and a very large number of facilitating groups got together, did this advocacy and did the policy change. That didn't lead to systemic change. The systemic change will have to happen when people stand on the road and really rebel or really do that kind of thing. That's something which is far, far more challenging. But policy push, policy advocacy, policy pressure, these do these do work, do change for the better, but not in the present regime. So that's an exception by far. So that I am excluding. Otherwise, it has happened. And not only in India, in many countries it has happened. But presently, the situation is also going in another direction, that I admit. So I'm not confusing between policy push or policy advocacy and systemic change. These two are different things. But the policy advocacy mechanism involving people, getting them to discuss, getting them to understand what is happening, that also helps in building up a momentum for ultimate system change. So that's the hope.
So can I just add to that a little bit? And there was also a question about what type and level of work can rural women be expected to do in urban areas from Shubneet. And I think, this actually continues the same point about systemic change, because when rural women come to urban areas or migrate to urban areas, they're really integrated at the bottom level. In terms of, again, class is very important. If they have some resources, if they have some networks, some relatives, maybe that gives them a cushion and they can look for better jobs. But otherwise, they actually end up at the bottom. I think a lot of the rural women from Bihar, Jharkhand, etc., Eastern India, who come to Delhi, for instance, end up as domestic workers. Whether they are single, they are live-in domestic workers. If they are married, then they live in slums. Their husband might work in a local factory, and they end up as domestic workers. And this is also, I think, just reinforces my point about the women's skills and the devaluation, that somehow it is seen that domestic work is something that all women know, they don't have to learn. So if they go for factory work or other more skilled work, they won't have the skills. We have this stereotype about rural women that they don't know, and therefore they may be less literate, they won't be able to work in factories. But if domestic work they can do without any training, without any skills, because all women know how to do domestic work. So I think that also creates the argument again for low pay, for saying that this is not anything difficult, this is something women are used to. So I think these are the structural or the systemic gender norms which also end up devaluing work of women, whether they are in rural or whether they are in urban areas. I think on terms of policy, I just wanted to make a distinction. Right now, I'm in Tamil Nadu, and I think it's quite interesting to make also a distinction between like social welfare policy and economic oriented policy. So one hand, the state will not want to make any systemic or structural change, this state or any other state, the state more so, like Soumya said, in terms of structures, in terms of economic power. But at the same time, they don't mind giving social welfare. So you give some LPG cylinder, or you give a TV, or you give a cooker, grinder, or a washing machine, or whatever it is, which are addressing also women and gendered roles, that it may help you a little bit. But this is I don't scoff at it, because it does help reduce drudgery, but these are like surrounding or side things, and they're not addressing really the crux of the resource. And just to take a recent example from the farmers' protest at the Singhu and the other border, when the Supreme Court actually said that women can go back home and do and so on, and Makam came up with a statement that actually these women who are sitting at Singhu border are farmers. They're not housewives who are coming and sitting there, but they are farmers. They need recognition as farmers. So I think this is where the policy gap is, that while there has been a lot of advocacy in terms of women's rights, and I said at the start of my presentation that a lot of progress, but the progress has been made more in terms of social welfare, human development, and not in recognizing women's work, not in labor, not in terms of capitalist society, because it's still good for capital to exploit women's labor. I think this was the old Marx and Engels, that actually the whole of industrialization and industrial production is dependent on women's unpaid labor. So there is a big interest for capital to keep women's labor unpaid and devalued. And so that's not changing in the policy space. The state doesn't want to acknowledge that these women are farmers, but it's saying, okay, you go back home, we'll give you an LPG cylinder that will help you do your cooking better.
Thank you, Nithya. Rosama makes a comment about how she had asked the environment officer of Pune for fruit trees, and he had said that it would create a nuisance, but apparently there are some mango trees in and around Pune. That's nice to know. We have a question from Gangotri, who's raised her hand. Gangotri, would you like to go?
Yeah, can I go now?
Yeah, please, Gangotri.
Yeah, so my question is in our daily life diet practice, what should we consume? Something local like fishes in the coastal area or something else that non-veg in northeast area, or should we go completely plant-based in a regular diet?
Your question is
May I respond?
Yeah, sure, Soumya.
See, this is a very tricky question because food choice depends on a lot of things. Food choice, what you will be doing. None of us, though we know what food has what impact on climate, on water, these are very well documented. But none of us say that boycott these or completely avoid this. But in terms of impact, if you want to know, see, the red meats are always, both in terms of carbon and water, they are very carbon and water intensive. But the practice of stall feeding rather than free grazed, this is also very damaging. So if you take meat, particularly red meat, and out of red meat, if it's stall fed, this has the largest carbon dioxide emission, this is the largest greenhouse gas emission, and largest water footprint, water consumption. So those kind of things are known, but that doesn't mean one has to, those societies who are accustomed have to completely forego this. These are questions of minimization and balancing. The other question is, there are, as I said, there are a lot of data on this, but the choices also have to be made based on what kind of things are available. Like in India now, in Europe, it has also, it's growing. In India, there is because of particular sort of communal religious overtones, there is a very strong growing voice that those who eat fish, meat, they are not of the same class as we are. We means quote unquote the vegetarians are. This is nonsense. In fact, fish, if it is grown, if fish is a non-consumptive water user, fish needs water, but it don't consume water. So those kind of understanding one have to go through. But I am again saying, if you want to have the data, there are clear data, which food has which kind of greenhouse gas emission impact, footprint, and which kind of water footprint. But then this also needs to be toned with which kind of nutrition, protein, and other vegetarian, other kind of nutrition sources some population has access to. If a coastal population largely depend on fish for their protein requirement, saying go vegetarian has no meaning. They have to go for fish, and they can go for some other cereal and other things. That if you go to Lakshadweep, I have been to Lakshadweep, they only eat the rice and things comes from, they call mainland, they call it import. They import the rice, and their local product produce is fish and coconut. So they have to live based on those kind of things.
Sorry, sir, fish and broccoli.
Coconut.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
If you go to Lakshadweep, because it's broken, it's not even sand, it is broken coral. So some kind of weed grows, which we call weed, and the coconut grows, and they get a lot of fish. And they get the rice from Kerala, basically. So if you tell them go vegetarian, they will beat you up, and that's inhuman. And that's true for a very large percentage of coastal population. But simultaneously, the kind of meat consumption that is growing in upper middle class and upper class societies, as we are going wealthier in those classes, there is an increasing meat consumption, and there is an increasing waste generation out of food. See, in India, not only the post-harvest losses, in India earlier, if you go back 25 years, the produced food waste was very little. Today, the produced food waste, if you look into any urban everyday kura kachra jo fenkte hai, if you look into that, a significant portion is food which is either over the date. It's perfectly all right, but it's over the date. So people say, no, don't take it, feko. So that's kind of thing. Or I have cooked much more because I have money, I can cook more. So this I cannot consume, so give it away or throw it. So that has increased tremendous, and those has tremendous water impact and tremendous GHG impact. So those kind of things needs countering. I don't know how, but campaigning, shaming, naming and shaming, whatever kind of things work, I don't know. Policies won't work here too much because the policies are being made by the same classes. The voices are the same.
Yeah, as the same thing you have talked about the jeans consumerism on fast fashion, jeans water consumption in jeans production. So that is the problem of overconsumption in every field, not only food, fast fashion, or anything specific.
It's
That is
true.
every.
True, but food is something very critical. We can't live without food. We can live without a pair of jeans or even without any jeans. We can live without any cars, but without food we cannot live. So ensuring the food and nutritional security equitably to everyone, that should be the first priority. And food includes water.
Yes.
Food is not devoid of water.
Yes. Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Soumyada, for that. And I think we've covered all the questions, and so it's also time. So on behalf of all the organizers, I would like to thank all our speakers for that wonderful, thought-provoking session we had. Thank you, Logan, for those wonderful visuals you gave us. I'm sure it'll inspire many of us to at least have balcony and backyard gardens for now. And Soumya, for your wonderful thought-provoking ideas on urban farming and the resources, lack of resources, and to Nithya for bringing in the gender dimension. I think we have a lot of food for thought for the weekend. So wishing you all a very happy weekend and stay safe. And thanks again to all of you.
Thank you, everybody, Bhargavi and PRC.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Bhargavi. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Just to end on a this note, we are having our next session tomorrow, 11 to 1 p.m. and that will be the second version of Stories from the Field. And hope to see you there. Stay safe. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay, thank you.